What is up, Planeswalkers? Theox6 back with some more upgraded new player decks, and today we're looking at the blue-red one. And this one, just like the last one, was a bit of a journey on what I decided to do. And once again, if you don't really want to see the deck tech or me discussing why I decided to play certain cards and for this one a certain deck, you'll find a link to the timestamps in the description below. And with that, let's get into it. Let's look at the base. So the best deck for this essentially is you're supposed to just be playing spells and getting some value out of those spells. You have some wizard synergy with things like Adeliz. You have the Enigma Drake thing. You have some cards that get back spells. But it was a little all over the place. A lot of 1-ofs, a lot of 2-ofs, and more than that, it just felt like it didn't have like a cohesive thing that it wanted to do. It even had Primal Amulet, and usually you want to play that in a certain type of deck, so it seemed like it was pulling itself in a bunch of different directions. That said, it does have decent value. You do get a Planeswalker, which is really fun. You do get some Adeliz, some Enigma Drakes, which are both their own decks, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But another thing that I found is just a lot of the cards they decided to use were just like not good at all. Star of Extinction it just shouldn't be in this deck. Like at all. This card, this isn't even a trap card. I think new players can see that this is probably not going to be very good. 20 damage is overkill in almost all circumstances. I mean, yes, it can wipe the board, but like with this type of deck, you aren't playing a deck with a small amount of creatures, right? Like this does have, I mean, 12 is a relatively small amount, but there are decks that play 8, and we'll get to that in a second. But it's just it's way overcosted, and it just doesn't do well. So I mean, in both of my decks, I cut out pretty much all the rares, I think, because they just weren't necessary, and in some cases they were just like bad to have. They're just taking the deck in too many different directions. So let's talk first about this one. This is what I assumed I would do. Just turn it into a blue-red Wizards deck. However, I found that it just wasn't. It was missing something. I don't know what it was. It could have just been my preferred playstyle doesn't really mesh with this very well, but I wasn't winning very well, and it just felt the hands were all very clunky. Even with 22 mana, I flooded out a decent amount of time, and it seemed like when I play against wizard decks, they do a lot better than it seemed like I was playing it. So I thought, well, let's depart from it a little bit. For those of you who are curious about playing the wizard deck, I will put the deck in the description, so you can check that out as well. It is a good deck. It is a played deck. People do play something similar to this. Obviously, it's missing the rares and the mythics, which I think is just like I hate the 1-mana card that it is. I cannot remember for the life of me what it is called. Where are you? Oh, I don't even think I have any. It's a 1-mana card from Amonkhet. And of course, it's like super important that I actually show what it is. Soulscar Mage. I had one. Awkward. It runs things like Soulscar Mage. I've seen some that run Chandras. But even without the super rare cards, it's still a fine deck. For whatever reason, it just wasn't working very well for me. So I decided to kind of have do the same thing with this as I did with the white-black one, and just like make it super different. There aren't nearly as many cards that the original deck had, but this is still a budget deck. Actually, yeah, I mean there are no rares other than the single Sulfur Falls, right? And if you can upgrade to having just 4 Sulfur Falls and probably no Highland Lakes, then you're golden. This is like a super budget deck. I think almost everything is uncommon or common. Yeah. And the way it wins essentially is just off of a single Enigma Drake or a single Cryptic Serpent. As you can see, we had exactly 8 creatures, right? We are very focused on casting spells, controlling what our opponent does, landing a single Serpent or Drake, preferably Drake because it does have evasion, and just winning in a couple of turns. So yeah, Drake gets more and more power, the more and more instant sorceries have, and it has nice evasion. You almost never want to play this on turn 3, because it's not going to be very large, and you're not going to be able to efficiently control your opponent. You're not going to be able to counter things properly, etc., etc. And then we do have some Cryptic Serpents as well. Really, these are kind of just like, in case your Enigma Drakes all die, having a deck with only 4 win conditions is kind of sketchy. So we do have Serpents as well. And this card you almost always only want to pay 2 mana for, and hopefully have the ability to have some other removal or something like that. Now, the deck does also run a single fling. This is fantastic if you are worried that your opponent is going to play a kill spell. If you have an Enigma Drake, that's going to be probably 8-10 power because of how many spells that you're going to cast over the course of a game, and your opponent points a kill spell at it, you can just sacrifice it in response using fling and deal that 10 damage directly to your opponent's face. Essentially, if you have the mana open and you have an Enigma Drake that's going to die, using fling is just always correct. Even if your opponent counters it, that's them not having a counterspell for your next Enigma Drake. It's just essentially a valuable way to burst your opponent. It's also very important if you have your opponent relatively low and your opponent has plenty of blockers for Cryptic Serpent, or even if they have flyers, and being able to just fling past that can win you some games sometimes. Speaking of reach, we do also have Shocks and Lightning Strikes. You will typically use these cards to burn your opponent's creatures early game, to make way for your Enigma Drakes and your Cryptic Serpents. But late game, like if your creatures have been killed, you're essentially in top deck mode and your opponent has the last few points of life, then Shock and Lightning Strike will help you finish that game off. We have some nice control spells. Essentially, we have 8 counter spells. Supreme Will does double duty in its ability to dig for one of our Enigma Drakes, preferably, or Cryptic Serpents if we have to. It's very nice in that regard. However, both of our counter spells are soft counter spells. At some point, Supreme Will and Syncopate will just run out of value, and if we are going up against an opponent who's just not really doing anything and they're just playing draw go, Syncopate may run out of utility very quickly. You could run a deck that eschews some of these soft counters for hard counters like Cancel, Negate, Essence Scatter. However, you do lose a little bit of your versatility because Syncopate can hit a creature or a non-creature. It just stops being effective at a certain point in the game. That said, once you hit a certain point in the game where you still need to counter things, it's possible that you're just going to lose. I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, the situations are very dependent, but sometimes you just can't deal with it. Then, of course, we have some draw. Supreme Will helps with that, but we also have 4 opts just to kind of dig through our deck, functionally making our deck 56 cards. The Scry is also helpful. Once you get to a certain point, you don't really need more lands. Then Glimmer of Genius, of course, is probably the best draw spell. It does rotate soonish, which is unfortunate. So does Supreme Will. But this deck is a really good thing to look for because Guild of Ravnica is printing another Drake. And it's a pretty good replacement for Cryptic Serpent. You know, you have the 3 Enigma Drakes and then the blue-red Drakes from Guild of Ravnica, which draws you a card and essentially has the rest of the same text as Enigma Drake, except also it counts the spells you have in Exile. So it's also going to be bringing some Replicate stuff, or Jumpstart. I don't know why I said Replicate. And that could theoretically help the deck out. So the deck is poised to continue to be actually good post-rotation. And it's going to likely be cheap because even a lot of the new cards that you're going to use are also uncommons. So Glimmer of Genius, yeah, just scries and draws. And then, of course, Blink of an Eye is if something got through our counter spells and we just need to like tempo bounce it, it also draws. It's helpful. Our lands, super stock. I should actually just make sure that it was the good amount. We are running 24. You do flood sometimes, but you really want to make sure you're hitting your like land drops. It is more of a control deck than an aggro deck. We are only running 8 creatures, and we want to essentially find a point in the game where we can switch the tempo, where we counter something of our opponents, and on our turn we go ahead and play an Enigma Drake. That's ideally what we want to do, with Enigma Drake being probably no smaller than 4 power. If it's smaller than that, it just takes too long, and it gives your opponent too much time to deal with it. But yeah, that's why we're running 24. You could probably get away with 23 and up your Blink of an Eye or up Fling, especially moving forward. I don't know if Fling is being reprinted. I don't remember. But if it is, Fling is probably a decent card to have as a 2 of. Highland Lake, you probably want to get rid of. Having this on turn 1 is fine, but you usually do want to be able to play either of these in the early games. But it's a really basic mana base. So let's get into some games. And I played several games with both, and I think that my specific playstyle does lend itself better to the Enigma Drake deck, so that's why I decided to go with this, going up against Fragment. You might find that the Wizard's deck is more your style. It is definitely an aggressive deck. This is a control deck. So if you find yourself playing aggro a little bit better, then I would suggest going with that. This is a fine hand. We have a late game value. We have an early game removal spell, as well as a mid game control spell. So I think this is fine. We have technically more lands than we need. We want to get to 4 mana, so having 4 mana in the opening hand is kind of bad, but it's fine. An opponent kept their 7. That is fine. And we're going to go ahead and lead off with an island. Playing mountain and then passing doesn't necessarily make our opponent think that we're going to be on aggro. So doing it like this doesn't really matter. Unfortunately, we drew another land. Not really where we want to be. We do want to, like, 5 mana is all we need, but it looks like our opponent isn't doing anything either. Probably on some sort of blue-black variant. And we could lightning strike their face, but we don't need to do that here. Let's go ahead and play a mountain, just stay at mana parity, and really unfortunate that we kept a 4-land hand and drew 2 lands in a row. My opponent is almost certainly on some sort of control, so our Supreme Wills are worth a lot more. So we're just going to keep passing the turn, and that opt is very helpful here. And just opt at the end of their turn. Could have opted during main phase, but didn't really have a reason to. So here we're just going to want to, if our opponent tries to cast some sort of good card, we just say no. And we're going to go and opt here. And what we really want to do, Glimmer of Genius is utterly fantastic here. It allows us to keep up that counterspell while still being still having something to do. Another counterspell here is great. A lot of the same concepts that I'm using playing this deck. Sure, that's fine. So this is something that I've found a lot of people make a mistake on. They counter someone's draw spell. Unless your opponent is struggling on lands, I don't suggest countering draw spells. It's much better, I'll go let this resolve now. It's much better to counter the card that actually matters, because if you counter the draw spell, they're still going to get to the point where they draw those cards anyway. Obviously, this does have scry, so they could theoretically bottom those cards, but not only does it leave you tapped out on your turn, because they did this end of turn, but it also means that that's 1 fewer counterspells for a card that actually matters. You're not going to lose the game because of them drawing 2 more cards. You're going to lose the game when they resolve an actual threat. So, obviously, the situation matters. Sometimes you do need to cast a counterspell on a draw spell, but I feel as if that is typically not the norm. And our opponent is on 8 cards, so they're going to either have to cast something or just let something get discarded. They cast a Tempest Djinn. We will go ahead and try and counter this, although I assume based on when our opponent did that they know that we had a counterspell, and they're going to... I assume they would have had a counter as well, but they did not. That does mean that we didn't get to use our Glimmer of Genius, but that's totally fine. So here you see we can play Cryptic Serpent for 5 mana, but that leaves us functionally tapped down, so we don't want to do that. Notably, a Supreme Will no longer work on a Tempest Djinn once they play 1 more land. And they play another land. Let's see what they want to do. Tempest Djinn only would have been, what, 3 power? No, just 2 power. So it wasn't too big of a problem. And we're going to Glimmer, and we'll see what our opponent decides to do if they try and counter this. If they counter it, I disagree with the counter. Yeah, I mean that's totally fine. That's 1 counter that they can't use on our 8 actual spells. So we'll just go ahead and play land. Cryptic Serpent is now on 4. Here, I actually think it's a good time to deploy it. We know that we got at least the Disallow out of their hand, and we still have mana up for Supreme Will. So I think this is one of the points where we should play it. Obviously, our opponent still could have a counterspell. If they have specifically Syncopate, we have enough mana to pay for it, since they can only do it for 2. And they didn't have a counter, so obviously they could have something like Vraska's Contempt. If they don't play a land, then we will be able to counter that with Supreme Will, but this is a good tempo point in the game to deploy one of our threats. We have Counter Magic up, and they blink of an eye, and they don't kick it. So I'm actually fine letting this resolve. And the reason is I don't want my opponent casting a 5-drop and me not being able to deal with it. That's fine. I can cast this again. They didn't get the draw value. All they got was a little bit of tempo, and I don't necessarily care. I just want to make sure I can counter something very important of theirs. It's possible, since this does have diminishing returns, that I won't get a chance to do that. Now they can play a 4-drop and still be able to pay for it. Divest. Ooh, they can get a creature. So yeah, that's a good combo. They are able to take the Cryptic Serpent, but they had to use 2 cards to deal with it. Right, that was 2 cards for 1 card. Though they do see my Supreme Will now. So they can essentially play around this perfectly. They don't have to care about my Supreme Will anymore. Because they should, theoretically, never cast something if they can't have it resolve. So that was good. That was decent sequencing on my opponent's part. We're just going to use the Supreme Will to try and find something else. Since our opponent knows about it, it's a lot weaker since it's a soft counter. And they might counter this if they have a counter. Just because they now know that we have essentially nothing in our hands and we're digging for something. So. See, looks like they're trying to tap something. Oh, you know what? They might have Gearhulk. Yep, Gearhulk is not good. Unfortunately, Gearhulk is we're playing against a deck with a bunch of mythics. Mythics and rares, because Wizards gave everyone a playset of these and a playset of these, so. Yep, that is incredibly unfortunate. We got an opt, which is nice. I mean, we could pay more mana for another opt just to get it out of our deck. I guess that's fine. It does just add to our card count. Supreme Will is fine, I suppose. Theoretically, like, our opponent's not gonna really need to play on it. They play 1 land, they can play a 5-drop, no problem. So we're gonna just use this now and see if we can get an Enigma Drake. We can't. There's an argument to be made for Blink of an Eye, but Blink of an Eye on that is really bad. So we're just gonna take the Glimmer and try and get there. Unfortunately, it looks like that Blink of an Eye, letting that through might have lost us the game. I still stand by my decision, based on the information I had at the time. I don't expect Divest typically in the main decks of things, but it's a fine card. Okay, so we got another Serpent, and we can go and play this for 2, which is very helpful. It does trade with Gearhulk, but I assume my opponent... I'm assuming my opponent has another Gearhulk in their hand, just based on what they've been doing. Because I think they've been looking at that card as well. So we'll just pass the turn. We do have access to Glimmer, but as I said, we want to use it on their turn just so they're less likely to be able to counter something on our turn. Into a Gearhulk, I assume they're going to bounce it. They did this wrong, though. Yeah, so they did this wrong. They should have waited till the end of my turn. I can just replay this card. Yeah, they messed up. They didn't wait. I can just recast this and still have 4 mana up. And I will unfortunately have to block, which does mean that 2 of my 8 like win conditions are gone, but it's not terrible. My opponent is down to 2 cards. We'll see if we can get out of this situation. It's not helpless. Go ahead and block here. I am dead in 2 turns, so I do need to find something good. I can find another Lightning Strike. I'm going to go ahead and respond here, because if our opponent does have a counterspell, we don't want them to get the draw off of Baral. We don't need either of these. If this was a Lightning Strike, we'd keep it, because we would be able to kill that Torrential Gearhulk, but... Syncopate is just dead at this point. Very, very unfortunate. Enigma Drake is nice. And I will kill Baral first. Enigma Drake will actually be very large, but we just get hit by Gearhulk here. So theoretically, I could block the Gearhulk. If, of course, Enigma Drake lives, which it looks like it might not. No, they're doing that. Okay. So the reason we can't win here, or we can't, like, race our opponent is they hit us, we go to 5. We hit them. Theoretically, we play another spell next turn. They go to 10. They hit me again, and I'm dead. So, unfortunately, I think I do need to block here. Actually, that's something that I didn't... Oh, gosh. Yep, and I have just enough mana to not pay for it, unfortunately. We'll see what we draw, but I'm fairly certain that that is the game. The deck does do a lot better against aggro. It's made to beat aggressive decks. And against control, it essentially can't do anything. My opponent should wait to use that. Yeah, my opponent's making a weird decision here, but yeah. So we had nothing, so we go ahead and concede. I actually realized something. I forgot that this card wasn't uncommon, so we're gonna amend the deck very slightly. Since we do flood out a little bit, we're gonna go ahead and take out 2 of those, and we're gonna throw in 2 Memorial to Geniuses. This does come in tapped, which means I might want to take out another Highland Lake and put in a mountain. In fact, I think I will. I messed that up. Sumptive Fierce. There we go. We should still have 24, yeah. I don't know if I trust that, but it's fine. Memorial to Genius is very good in that situation, just because we don't have to worry about flooding out nearly as much. So let's see if we get an aggro deck. Aggro is what we're better against, going up against Canned Monkey. That's weird. Usually monkeys are in barrels, but we're going first here. That's very nice. Double Enigma Drake is not, honestly, just because we only have like 1 spell going on. That said, we do have Memorial to Genius, so it's kind of fine, so we will keep this. This is essentially a draw spell that's very, very slow. And we'll lead off with Highland Lake just so that we guarantee the ability to play Lightning Strike if we need to. A blue deck of some kind. Let's see if they play something with it. And they do. Okay, so this is like that weird unblockable deck. I'm gonna wait until my opponent... There's an enchantment that usually this deck runs, and I'm gonna see if my opponent plays that here, and I can kill it in response. So it's a Baral, actually. I think I would rather kill Baral just because they have the potential to get like out of control, get more frustrating. So why did I do it at that moment? I have no idea. So we'll take 1. Yep, since we drew a land, we're just gonna Enigma Drake here. I said during the deck tech that you don't really want to deploy it, but we're racing at this position because we don't have anything else going on, essentially. This is the blue, like, weird aggro deck, and we might be able to race them, depending on what we draw. Glimmer of Genius is very helpful. I will go ahead and attack. Opponent does have a wizard, so they might have a counterspell, and I think they would counterspell my Glimmer of Genius. So I'd much rather do it on their turn, or if they tap out. They do run the Merfolk, I believe, the Wizard Merfolk that taps a creature and has it lose ability. I actually think I'm not going to attack here. I would rather block the Siren. Yeah. My creatures are going to get bigger relatively fast. So I would much rather be able to block the Siren. Obviously, they are still able to put an enchantment on the Slitherblade. But theoretically, we could get removal for that. I assume they're just going to attack with this. Yep. That's fine. Don't need to block. Still at 17. Not terrible. Alright, and we'll Glimmer and see if our opponent decides to counter it. Nope. So another Glimmer is good. Supreme Will is not terrible in this situation, to be honest. Just because they are low on mana. Yeah, I think both of these are good cards to draw. I was thinking about putting back Supreme Will, but just the ability to counter something up there is nice. And we got another one that's good. So I could start attacking. Do I need to start attacking here? They deal 2 damage to me, I deal 2. So I go to 15, they go to 18. I have a thing next turn, so I go to 13, they go to 15, 1 more. I could start now, but again, I think I would rather just wait another turn. I'm a very conservative player, in that I take fewer risks. I make fewer proactive plays typically, and that has bit me before, and it could theoretically bite me soonish. So here I'm actually fine just countering this. Yeah, I don't want my Enigma Drake tapped, and I also don't want them to develop to the board, so I'm totally fine countering this. If they end up removing my Enigma Drake completely, that's fine. We have another one, and we have a Cryptic Serpent, not Serpent. Taking one again, that is fine. I do think I'll start attacking at this point. Let's see, so we're at 6 mana. So theoretically, we could cast Supreme Will, and this would become 3 mana, but we don't need to. Let's see, I go to 14, they go to 17, next turn they go to 13, I go... Yeah, so I do think I'm going to start attacking. Interesting, okay. Once again, honestly, I'm gonna... They forced my hand, and they made it so I'm going to cast my Cryptic Serpent now. I'm also gonna get in for a sweet 4 damage. I can actually cast Serpent for cheaper, so I think I might just go with my second Drake. It also flies, which is kind of important, so... I should have waited till after combat, just because my opponent might have made a different block decision. Sure. And they could, like, unsummon this, but choose not to. They're on 5 cards. I do have a Glimmer of Genius, which is very helpful. I also have a Memorial, so I do like the addition to Memorial. And that keeps it at bay very nicely. In one swing, I got them to where it took them several swings to do. Still on 3 mana. Cool, got another land. And yeah, I think we're in full race mode. To be honest, I think I might just Glimmer now. Usually you don't cast instants at sorcerer speed, but I think in this specific scenario it's fine. We up our clock a little. I think Syncopate might be fine here. I played a land already, I believe. I think Syncopate's fine just to keep making it so that they can't really cast anything. I don't know if they're stuck on lands. I do know that this deck doesn't play very many. So I think doing this is fine. Always worried about OBS. Yeah, I did play a land. And we're not gonna play the Cryptic Serpent here. We're just gonna hold up Syncopate and go into attacks. Hovering for some reason. Yep, alright. So next turn. Yeah, and they decide to concede. Very, very good. This is the type of thing I'm talking about. We're relatively good at shutting down our more aggressive opponents. Obviously, you could argue that our opponent had a bad draw. I don't think they did, based on what I've seen from this deck before. I think that's relatively consistent from that type of deck. The deck does really well against like low to the ground aggro, since you have a bunch of shocks and things like that. And usually they don't have a high mana count, so your soft counters work very long. Against green, it also does relatively well. Not as well, just because our burn doesn't match up as well. But we are able to counter the things a little better than some. But where it kind of does falter is against other control decks. You need to be more aggressive against other control decks. You want to get an Enigma Drake down as fast as possible, and start chipping in, even if it is just 1 damage at a time. If you can get under their counter spells, it's very helpful. Yeah, I mean, I really do like the deck. As I said, if you prefer a more control-y style, go with the Enigma Drake deck. We're getting some good stuff from Izzet in Guild of Ravnica, which is fantastic. And if you prefer the aggro version, go with the Wizards. I'm going to have both in the link in the description below for you guys to check out. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I would like to thank Easy Mode, Chris, DizzyFam, Daniel, Flowerchild, and ChowOD3 for supporting the channel. Their donations on Patreon lead directly into me buying more packs so that viewers can request more decks, and I'll actually be able to make those decks for you guys. If you would like to join them in supporting the channel, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the description below, and there should be a little like annotation things that comes up at the end of the video. Yeah, I hope you guys liked it. If you did, go ahead and tap that like button, add a subscription to your Manifold, cast a comment in the comment section down below, and until next time, all will be one.